Well, welcome to the 700 Club. America could be facing a twin-demic, a harsh flu season coupled with a COVID spike.
Well, health officials are recommending flu shots along with COVID boosters, which should begin rolling out this week. Medical reporter Lori Johnson explains how we can protect ourselves against this double threat.
The U.S. may soon enter an unusually severe flu season, one that starts earlier than most and hits children especially hard. Our flu season generally follows what happens in the southern hemisphere, which is just now finishing its most severe in 5 years. This go-round is characterized by an early onset, which tends to make it worse, and kids aged 5 to 9 had the highest rates of infection, followed by children 4 and under.
So if you look at Australia, for example, they are just completing their winter months as we up in the northern part of the planet start to enter into fall and winter. And so what we glean from that is we're able to tell what kind of a flu season awaits us by looking at what happened down there.
Last year, the world saw very little flu, and the year before, almost none at all, possibly due to isolating and masking to avoid COVID. This year, though, more people are resuming pre-pandemic activities.
In the United States, up to 30,000 people die a year from the flu. And they're usually very elderly, people that have underlying medical conditions, or the very young.
Doctors recommend a flu shot, ideally before Halloween, as the best way to avoid the flu or suffering severe complications. It takes full effect after a couple of weeks and lasts about 6 months.
You want to be protected even at the tail end of the flu season, which might be March or April of 2023.
Speaking of vaccines, a new COVID booster is available that's touted to be more effective against the Omicron variants.
All previous evidence with regards to co-vaccinating with the COVID vaccines and influenza vaccines show there was no side effect or no ill effect of doing them both at the same time. So we would assume that that would be the trend that continues with a newer version of a COVID vaccine.
Despite these measures, the U.S. could see a spike in both viruses.
There's always the risk of something along the lines of what's been called a twin-demic at times, and that's when a very strong flu season would be paired with a strong, COVID peak during the flu season as well.
In that case, hospitals could become overwhelmed.
A higher amount of ICU bed utilization. There's a lot more folks coming into the emergency departments and overwhelming that. Patients on ventilators, canceling elective surgeries so that you can manage the amount of patients that are being hospitalized.
And while doctors are pushing both vaccines, they can be a tough sell, Gordon. The flu shot vaccination rate usually hovers only around 50%, which is actually even lower than the COVID vaccination rate, which is about 70%, Gordon.
Well, Lori, I've got to ask, we had such low flu rates during the pandemic. A lot of that based on people wearing masks and not shaking hands and social isolation. Why are we now predicting such high rates? Have we really gone back to more social interaction? We are vulnerable to getting an infection?
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. So what we're seeing in the southern hemisphere is people going back to the types of behaviors that we saw before the pandemic. So folks have ditched the masks. They're back in close contact. They're not working from home anymore. You see a lot of people gathering for events inside, and so that really does increase flu transmission.
All right. Well, how do you tell if you have a cold or the flu or COVID? If you're getting sick, what do you do to find out what you have?
You know, a lot of doctors even have trouble with this one because the symptoms of cold, flu, and COVID are very similar. You're talking about, just feeling yucky, having a headache, sore throat, a cough, fever, body aches. And so doctors generally say that the symptoms of a cold and a flu are very similar, except a cold is less severe. So generally, if you feel yucky, if you feel under the weather, it's probably a cold. If you feel like you've been hit by a bus, that's probably the flu. Same thing with COVID. Very similar symptoms, except COVID has a few that are just unique to COVID. Loss of taste, loss of smell. But, a lot of people don't have those symptoms. So the best way to know whether you have cold, flu, or COVID is to get tested. A lot of us have those COVID home tests, and you can test for COVID at home. And you can even, in many cases, just call your doctor on the phone and say, hey, I tested positive for COVID, and your doctor can just call in a prescription for Paxlovid. A lot of people see a great benefit from that. So that way you don't even have to go to the doctor's office, which is great for everyone. If you test negative for COVID and still feel really bad, you might want to go to the doctor's office and get tested for flu. There is a different antiviral, Tamiflu, and a couple other ones that are great for treating the flu.
Well, let's talk about prevention. People are now predicting yearly or even every 6 months getting a COVID shot. What does this mean? Are we going to be living with flu, COVID? We've been living with flu and colds for a long time, but is COVID now here to stay?
Unfortunately, yes. Almost all of the health experts say this is going to be with us for good, and it's not going to be going away. And what's likely to happen is we're going to be offered and encouraged to take a yearly COVID vaccine, COVID booster, much like we do with the flu, rather than have these new boosters and new guidance and everything come up every few months.
All right, Lori, thanks for the insight. Well, in other news, members of Congress are now back from their August break, and they're preparing to do battle over raising the debt ceiling. Ephraim Graham has that story and more from the CBN newsroom. Ephraim?
Gordon, Democrats and Republicans will work on a continuing resolution to keep the government running until December. The White House wants extra money in the CR for things like COVID, monkeypox, and Ukraine support. Billions of dollars that might run into GOP opposition if there are no offsets. Same-sex marriage could also come up for a vote in the resolution or separately. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer laid out the schedule in August.
We will have a vote on marriage equality. That's what you're supposed to call it. We will have a vote on it. Okay. I'm not giving you a timetable. We'll come back in September. There's a whole lot to do.
The Marriage Equality Act codifies protections for same-sex marriage. It's possible it will get 60 votes in the Senate, with some Republicans already giving it support. The House already passed a bill. Heat, fires, and floods. Extreme weather is hitting both coasts of the country. An historic heat wave in California is threatening the state's power supply. And heavy rain brought flash floods to parts of the Northeast. Charlene Aaron has the story.
California officials issued an emergency warning Tuesday as demand for electricity reaches an all-time high due to excessive heat gripping much of the state. A brutal heat wave has been smothering California for weeks, pushing the state to the brink of blackouts.
Look what happened yesterday. All of these high temperatures broke the daily high temperatures in Fresno, Bakersfield, Reno, and in Elko, Nevada.
The state capital of Sacramento tied a record Tuesday with its 41st day of temperatures reaching at least 100 degrees.
We seem to always just make it through. We have our little tricks to keep cool. Everybody does.
Governor Gavin Newsom warns it will get worse in the days ahead and is urging residents to conserve energy.
Run your air conditioning earlier in the day when more power is available. And we encourage you to close your windows and blinds to keep your home cool as well. Please turn your thermostat up to 78 degrees or higher and avoid, to the extent possible, using any really large appliances.
The heat is also fueling deadly wildfires. The Fairview fire in Southern California has scorched some 2,000 acres, killing 2. At least 1,500 households were forced to evacuate as the fire rages over the hillsides, with flames destroying everything in its path. Meanwhile, on the East Coast, heavy rains bringing flooding to some states. On I-95 in Rhode Island, more than 4 inches of rain fell in a short amount of time. And in Providence, this building collapsed from the storm. And the 2022 hurricane season is starting to pick up steam. Forecasters are tracking 4 storms in the Atlantic. 2 are hurricanes, but so far, none are predicted to make landfall. It's been a quiet hurricane season so far. For the first time in 25 years, there were no named storms in the Atlantic in August. However, September is considered peak season, and a tropical storm formed on the very first day of the month. Charlene Aaron, CBN News.
Extreme conditions on both coasts. Gordon?
And around the world, it's not just here in the United States, but Europe's had unbelievable weather this whole summer. The only good news on this is that the massive hurricane season that was forecast so far hasn't come to pass. So that's one piece of good news in all the flooding, all the devastation, all the wildfires, everything we're seeing around the world.